Hi, welcome everyone. We're going to get started in a few minutes. So maybe grab your coffee or tea or do that bathroom break, and we'll see you in a few seconds. I welcome those who are just joining the room. We're going to start in about another minute, so just hang tight. And thank you for making time today. Okay, everyone, it's around 12:02, so I think we're going to get started. Welcome to our conversation today. I'm really looking forward to having this chat with two amazing colleagues about intersectional violence and the AAPI experience. Before we get started, I just wanted to note that folks tuning in can submit questions via the Q&A function. We will try our best to address these questions live, but if we don't get to them and you ask using your name, we will reach back out to you after today's conversation, hopefully provide answers or at least some resources. So today's conversation is being co-hosted by Sanctuary for Families, ECPAT-USA, and the Immigrant History Initiative. Sanctuary for Families, as many of you know, is New York's leading service provider and advocate for survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, and related forms of gender violence. And I am Amy Hsieh. I'm an attorney and currently serving as the Deputy Director of the Anti-Trafficking Initiative in the Legal Center. We're meeting today for a couple of reasons. As you know, on March 16th, a shooter targeted two Asian-owned massage businesses in Atlanta, shot and killed 8 people, 7 who were women, 6 who are of Asian descent. And since then, there have been additional anti-Black and anti-Asian acts of violence and massacres. In this moment in US social and political climate, and with the rise of anti-Asian violence, we're seeking to reflect on this horrific loss of life, to process a little bit together about what happened and maybe why it happened, and think through possible ways we and others in our community of advocates, of gender violence and anti-trafficking advocates, of service providers of Asian and Asian American survivors, and just a community of people who value human lives. Think through what actions we can take together to prevent anything like this from happening again. So before we dive in, I wanted to give Kathy and Yvonne a chance to briefly introduce yourselves. So maybe Kathy, you would like to go first?
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you for that intro. So I'm Kathy. I'm kind of wearing 2 hats in this conversation today. I am a staff attorney with the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at Sanctuary for Families, but I am also here today as the co-founder of the Immigrant History Initiative. We are a small grassroots nonprofit organization that works to highlight immigrant histories that have been whitewashed or silenced. Most recently, we have been working directly with affected communities of anti-Asian violence and producing anti-racist resources, both for educators and for the general public, on how to really understand the roots of the violence that we see today and how to begin opening up these really important conversations within the home and also just with our communities.
Great. So my name is Yvonne Chen. I am the Director of Private Sector Engagement at ECPAT-USA. And at ECPAT-USA, we are a anti-trafficking agency that specifically focus on the prevention and advocacy of child trafficking and child sexual exploitation. And so we have a few different programs with our youth education program, our private sector engagement, and our legislative and advocacy and policy work. And today I come to you also bringing in a background of formerly working a lot more with our East Asian clients, specifically working in massage businesses.
So I think we can just kind of jump right into the conversation. We've heard a lot of like media reports about Atlanta already, and maybe somewhat of a rhetorical question, but let's talk about it anyway. Is what happened in Atlanta new, or is it the product of the pandemic or any of the anti-immigrant rhetoric in the past few years? What do you both think?
I can jump in as a history nerd. So whenever I hear this question, I'm kind of like, I think I understand where this question comes from, right? Because I think it's really easy to take an ahistorical view of what's going on, especially because you can trace it very clearly to a lot of rhetoric that was being espoused by people in power over the past several years. But at IHI, thinking about like the long arc of history, the first thing I usually think of when I hear this question is the 1875 Page Act, because it is such a perfect parallel to what we saw in many ways happening with the Atlanta shootings, but it occurred, almost 150 years ago.
And let me take a pause for a second here. So I took immigration law in law school, and I think we always start the conversation on the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was, I think, 1890. I don't remember what year, but a little bit later. So why don't we talk about the 1875 Page Act?
Yeah. That's a great question, Amy. And like you said, so the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was passed 7 years after the 1875 Page Act. So if we're going to be talking about major restrictions by the federal government on immigration, we should really be starting with the 1875 Page Act, but we don't. And I think the answer that you're going to get for that a lot of the time is just impact, right? Because at the time, the 1875 Page Act, and I'll go into a little bit later what this act was for people who are unfamiliar, but this act really only impacted Asian women. And at the time, numerically speaking, there were just a lot more Asian men migrating to the United States than Asian women. So numerically speaking, the Page Act didn't have a whole lot of impact. But putting kind of the numbers argument aside, I would say a deeper reason behind why we don't talk about the 1875 Page Act is because in the classrooms, we don't really know how to deal with gender. And I think this is a problem we see again and again throughout history. We don't know how to talk about gender. And with the 1875 Page Act, which talks specifically about prostitution, if you're throwing sex into it, then people just don't want to touch it, even though children are internalizing these stereotypes about sex and about gender from a very, very young age. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. And I don't want everybody to read what's on the screen because it's just like blocks and blocks of text. But what I have here is the text of the 1875 Page Act, because I want to dissect it with everybody really quickly. So the 1875 Page Act, at its core, really, it's an anti-trafficking bill, which I think is very interesting because that's not what it's remembered for now, because that's not actually what it did. The 1875 Page Act didn't actually help with trafficking. What it did was give the US government a vehicle to begin systematically excluding Asian women, primarily at this time, Chinese women, from entering the country. So you can see here, it's very clear that this bill is about quote unquote Orientals, right? China, Japan, or any Oriental country. And yet, if you go 2 paragraphs down to section 3, you have here this clause that is specifically about prostitution. The importation of women for purposes of prostitution is hereby forbidden. And this section is completely race neutral, right? There's no mention of the nationality of any of these women. It's just been kind of stuck into this Immigration Act that is purportedly about quote unquote Oriental migrants. And so I really like to highlight this because I think you can really see the work of implicit bias at play here. Why is the US government putting in this race neutral provision on prostitution in the middle of this Anti-Trafficking Immigration Act about Asian migrants. There are a lot of assumptions at play here. First, about how prostitution is being imported into the country, right? The idea that prostitution is this foreign danger, that this is something that is coming from abroad and not being homegrown. And so there's kind of this outside target to really attack and blame for the quote unquote moral decay of prostitution that they're trying to combat. But also you can see there are serious stereotypes at play here about who they think specifically these prostitutes are. And that would be Asian woman, Chinese woman. And so what you saw after the Page Act, there were never that many Asian women coming into the country, but after the Page Act, those numbers are basically halved because immigration officials were using this act as a reason to first conduct extremely invasive medical exams on the people coming in to try to detect if they are in some way going to be involved in the sex trade. And then also just give them a reason to just exclude them, keep them out of the country altogether. And so I really like to highlight this and talk about the text, even though the text is long and it's a little boring, because I think it really ties into what we saw in Atlanta in terms of implicit bias still taking such a big role in how we think about Asian women and about sex. Because when you look at news coverage of the Atlanta shootings, focusing specifically on the shooter and how the shooter describes his motivations, right? He's trying to resist temptation. He's trying to get rid of this temptation towards sin. And so that framing looks race neutral, but it's actually not. It's actually tied into these really deep roots of misogyny, of racism, of the intersection of these forces at play when we see Asian women and we fetishize them and we objectify them. It's something that has been going on for centuries. And I also want to take a moment to talk about the connection to the pandemic, because I think on its surface, people might think that the Atlanta shootings are a little bit of an aberration from the general rise in anti-Asian violence during the COVID-19 pandemic, because there's not really a clear connection, right, between this shooter being angry about Asian women tempting him to sin versus racial scapegoating for the pandemic. But I want to talk about how these stereotypes are really deeply interconnected, because I think when you look at it within the landscape of the COVID-19 pandemic, it makes a lot of sense, like really tragic, unfortunate sense, but it makes sense. So I'm going to move to another webpage here. So this is a map from 1885 that we use in one of our lesson plans. IHI created a lesson plan on the series of smallpox epidemics that occurred in San Francisco in the late 1800s. And this lesson plan is meant to really highlight the parallels between what happened in San Francisco and what's happening today, because you see a lot of the same patterns. San Francisco Chinatown residents were heavily scapegoated for spreading the smallpox virus, even though there was literally zero evidence that they were spreading it any more than other parts of the population. And so there was increased surveillance, a lot of violence, even calls to condemn the entire Chinatown neighborhood as a nuisance and evict everybody and drive them out. So in the lead up to these policy proposals of condemning Chinatown, they did a lot of quasi-scientific mapping of the neighborhood. And so what I have here is a map that they created in 1885. This was created by city officials. So it's not just random people. This is something that was state funded. And the most, I would say, eye-catching thing about this map, I don't know if you can see it on your screens, but it's these many, many rectangles of green. And what is labeled here on these green blocks is CP, which stands for Chinese prostitution. So the makers of this map are really highlighting these blocks and blocks and blocks of what they believe specifically to be Chinese brothels in this map about Chinatown to try to convince people that Chinatown is a nuisance that needs to be closed down. And so you really see kind of the interplay here between these stereotypes of not just quote unquote moral decay, right, or impurity, but also with ideas about hygiene, about illness, about filth and contagion. All of these are so deeply interconnected. So I think when we kind of zoom back out and look at the Atlanta shootings within this landscape, all of these are connected to these same really troubling stereotypes about Asian people that have existed for centuries. And so I know I talked your ears off about history now. And so let's pivot back to current day. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So I wanted to ask Amy and Yvonne about the massage businesses that we're seeing today, right? The massage businesses that really kind of crashed into the national consciousness with the Atlanta shootings. Something that I've been seeing on the news cycle a lot is kind of this reoccurring question of, are they all providing sexual services? Like, what is going on in these massage businesses?
I can jump in here for a second and just to say, and particularly for folks who are tuning in, so in Sanctuary's Anti-Trafficking Initiative, we've worked with many people who have experiences at massage businesses who have been arrested there, and primarily with clients who identify as survivors of trafficking. And what we've learned from them and from the many, I want to say over 1,200 individuals we've met over the past couple of years, we know that not all massage businesses are offering sexual services or perpetrating trafficking. There are legitimate Asian-owned massage businesses offering massage services, and there are also massage businesses where it is a commercial storefront used to hide commercial sexual activity. And so when we conflate the two and we just call them all Asian massage parlors, we're suggesting that one, an Asian-owned massage business is maybe delegitimized, maybe automatically offering sexual services. And I think, two, it really suggests kind of to broader hearers or just kind of the underlying consciousness or assumptions about Asian looking massage businesses as a place that is offering illicit services. And that kind of conflation of those two concepts is very deadly for the workers inside and for the women who are in these settings. I think it's precisely the kind of thing that allows entitled sex buyers to come in with their male privilege, with their kind of race privilege, and demand sexual services and even use violence and other forms of coercion and force to extract it from the people inside. And so in the Atlanta shootings, I think it's precisely kind of what Kathy, you talked about, just kind of this assumption that the Asian, Chinese, Korean people working in these businesses offer those services. And I think the news cycle played out a little bit in that way. So I think, I guess one thing I wanted to caution listeners, and we've talked about this, I think amongst the three of us, just try not to just say massage parlor, because I think that moves us to thinking massage parlor equals Asian owned or something like that, because we don't ever use massage parlor to talk about, like, say, a Caucasian owned massage business. But I think the other piece of it is not making assumptions about what was happening in the particular places that were targeted in Atlanta. I know that there had been news reports about potentially those locations being reviewed on buyer user review boards like rub maps, but that said, we don't know about these particular individuals. We don't know if they offered these services. We don't know if they identify as such. They definitely, I don't know if they definitely don't call themselves sex workers, but I could say that the majority, 99.9% of my clients don't use that language to describe themselves. Working in massage, it's a business that's unlike any other job, and it's one that I think they will say they've survived and went to, not out of just complete free choice, but particularly because of their circumstances. And I think generally there's like a huge stigma around prostitution, and for that reason, for many of our clients, they don't just kind of openly come out and talk about being identified as sex workers, and primarily just kind of having survived the situation at the massage business.
Yeah, and I
Oh,
want to
sorry.
add, I think it's really important to highlight that assumptions have a very big impact. I don't think necessarily we talk enough also about the violence that can happen from assumptions, because I think oftentimes in society we might pass off assumptions or generalizations as harmless. But I think here we're seeing, I learn something new from Kathy every time she talks about history, because I need more education on immigrant history and my own history, and really thinking about the assumptions at play really have such a long-standing impact, and things that we may not have as thought about have really played out in the Atlanta shootings, but also just in general, the violence that occurs, the personal experiences that we have as Asian American women. And I think that is really important to highlight. Like, we really need to be challenging a lot of these assumptions that we made and where they're coming from, because if we keep dismissing them, that's when a lot of violence can happen. And so that's something I wanted to highlight as we're talking about this, and how the media has also really kind of taken the narrative of this story.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, thank you for bringing that up, Yvonne. But now that we're talking about trafficking, I mean, were the Atlanta victims trafficked in these massage businesses?
Um, Kathy, if I may, maybe I should just take a moment to just define trafficking for folks tuning in. And so there are multiple definitions of what is human trafficking, and we'll just, for the purposes of this conversation, just focus on the federal definition found in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And that is a severe form of trafficking in persons. And in very, very condensed version, essentially is commercial sex resulting from force, fraud, or coercion, or involuntary servitude, debt, bondage, peonage by force, fraud, or coercion. And I think force, fraud, or coercion ends up being kind of the pivotal words to think about whether something rises to the level of trafficking. But primarily for our clients, we're often thinking about coercion in particular. And coercion's further defined in the statute as a couple of things, but primarily for my clients' purposes, it's any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that failure to perform an act, and in sex trafficking, it's a commercial sex act, would result in serious harm to or physical restraint against any person. So it could be themselves or someone else. And so maybe I will test Yvonne here for a second. And so using that definition, what do you think? Do you feel like what we know about the Atlanta victims and the people there kind of, do you think they're trafficking survivors? Or
I all of a sudden felt like I was back in school. Got the pop quiz. So yeah, I mean, I think what we do know is not much. I think we know somewhat about the people who were killed and the women who were killed, as well, specifically of East Asian descent. But I think what we don't want to assume anything, I think, is what it is. Like, we're talking about assumptions. Again, we're really thinking about what we know as fact. And so the fact is, we don't know whether or not they were involved in commercial sex. We don't know whether or not they were personally experiencing exploitation or trafficking. But I think we do know, and we can say that this violence happens when there's racism, when there's sexism and misogyny, and when there is anti-immigrant narratives and assumptions around these businesses, right? The assumption that I can go in here and decide that they're doing something that's wrong, and so I'm going to get rid of my own temptation and decide to go in and target these spaces to shoot. And so I think part of it is really just understanding there's a lot of narrative around, was there exploitation, was there trafficking, was there prostitution, was there X, Y, and Z. But I think at the baseline, at the core point, is these women and these people, including like another, like a customer and things like that, were shot and killed because this person had targeted them, these businesses, and these Asian-owned businesses. And so I think that's kind of what it is, because we want to be careful of unintentionally implying that if someone was engaged in commercial sex if someone was trafficked, if someone was X, Y, and Z, then there was some sort of justification for this. And there isn't. The baseline is this happened, and this is the result of all of these intersections of violence and racism and anti-immigrant, anti-Asian hate. And I think so. I think it's really a mix of all of those really played a part in this space.
Thanks, Yvonne. Yeah, and I mean, for I think all three of us having worked so closely with people who've had experiences in massage businesses, I definitely want to come back to this conversation about how we can actually serve them and continue to serve them. But for a moment, let's kind of step, I think, back a little bit from massage businesses specifically. What do you think is the impact of the Atlanta shootings on the broader Asian American community, which I guess each of us is a part of as well?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. You know, I think part of this is recognizing that there is an uptick of a trend in anti-Asian violence. And, you know, as Kathy had mentioned, violence against Asians is nothing new. This is really ingrained in the history that of the xenophobia and the anti-immigrant, especially anti-Asian immigrant narrative. And that's part of it. And so the Atlanta shootings really were a culmination of all of these different things that really forced us to see what can happen when we don't pay attention, and we don't pay attention to the violence, and we don't pay attention to acknowledging and increasing violence, specifically in this time, specifically within COVID. I think it's a conversation around people being scared and concerned about just going out. There's a conversation around gun violence. I think this is also just the impact of it is an opportunity that people are watching and caring and really wanting to genuinely know like how this happened and why this happened. But I think really understanding that there's so many assumptions rooted in these racial stereotypes that a lot of people just have not really thought about. And I think, you know, there's history, the immigration history of this, of our society really has a part. I think media has a big portrayal in this, how media has portrayed specifically Asian people, and even more specifically Asian women, as a fetish and as an exotic thing. And so I think that's part of it. And you know, I think what I can see also the impact happening if we're not careful is additional raids and policing on these massage businesses, and which can be harmful for the people who are working there. And so I think it's really thinking about how we can serve these communities, but I think just also kind of recognizing that these things are happening, because I think for so long, Asian Americans have felt really invisible in this narrative of the country, because we've been told that we've assimilated to whiteness, and people use Asian communities as a tool to pivot against other minorities or majorities in the US. And so really just thinking about that, and I think hopefully we can really stay in this moment, because I think with the Atlanta shootings, it also triggered a lot of people in trauma that was unrecognized, specifically as Asian American women, really thinking about the trauma of being exoticized or fetishized in our own daily lives. And so I think part of that is it had also unleashed a lot of trauma that people had not recognized, and now are really realizing the impact of that on them personally. And I think that's why a lot of communities had just such a strong reaction to a lot of this, and horror and rage and grief.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Yvonne. Yeah, I think you and I have had a conversation about it, but just I think your point about kind of triggering for us and people in our community, kind of that very personal level of like kind of unprocessed trauma is a huge thing. And I think like in other conversations that you and I have had, we've talked about like even people kind of approaching us on the street. And quite literally, when I went to do outreach in a different country, people approached me asking to buy sexual services. And I was not even in there kind of in my anti-trafficking role, kind of doing any of that. So yeah, I think that those narratives maybe aren't even just here in the US, they really have kind of spread globally too. I think what I wanted to share also, just as far as kind of what that means for the broader community, but relating to our clients still, is that I think there is this kind of increased generalized fear of going to the public, going to work. In speaking to some of our clients, they have rightfully admitted they're terribly frightened. As people who have worked in these places, they've experienced robberies, sexual assaults, and even though these are things that they should normally want to report to law enforcement or seek help from, they've been told stories from their coworkers, from the managers in these places, or their bosses, that the safest place to stay is within those doors, because America is a dangerous place. It's full of crazy people with guns, and I think what happened in Atlanta really played out for them, and unfortunately gives, I think, potential exploiters like one more lever of control. And so that is something that I'm really want to think through, either on on this conversation, during this conversation, or even after, kind of thinking about how we can help to break those myths for newly arrived migrants, and also to be reaching out to the community. But I guess, Yvonne, do you feel like it's kind of limited to this moment or to this particular generation, or like, kind of, is the impact, uh, as far as we as a society want to take it right now, or is there more to it?
Yeah, I think thinking about culturally, when we're thinking about a collective culture and how community is really important to a lot of us in the Asian diaspora, and really thinking about how these events and traumas and experiences really ripple through um, our our ancestors and our communities and our families, and I think there's just a lot of, as we've seen, like Kathy say, even with that map, the ripple effects of the history of the anti-Asian policies and misogyny. I think about the children and the family members of people who were killed, um, and people who have experienced violence, and even so, I think about the child of the woman who was who one of the women who was killed in the Atlanta shootings has to take care of a younger brother. There was money raised for to support them, but also, like, he had also mentioned that his mom had told others that she had worked at the makeup store. And so I think because there's also so much stigma around working in a massage business, regardless of what is happening, I think these things really affect communities, and they really affect how we live as a community, and they affect how we feel like we can talk to people or relate to people or even trust others. I think about young women and girls who are fetishized and exoticized because of just what they look like. And what does that mean for society? And like, what has that meant for me? What has that meant for our younger generation as well? What effects do the racism and misogyny have on young people that can then make them also vulnerable to exploitation? And or vulnerable to not being able to feel like they have a community or people they can talk to. And so I think it's really important to recognize that because of this one instance on someone's life, or this mass shooting, or one person's exploitation, or one person's trauma, they all have a ripple effect, and they're all interconnected with everyone else that's in their lives. And so even people who have, a lot of the people that have worked in these spaces have children and have people that they're supporting. And what does it mean if they're in another country? There was another woman who was killed in that, and she didn't have any family here in the US. So another nonprofit agency raised money for her funeral. So I think it's really thinking about on a macro level too, and understanding like how we're all connected and how that trauma can really impact people. At ECPAT, we really talk about young people and the young generation, and really working alongside people who've experienced that as survivors, but also just children and really talking to young people about these topics, because it's important to have a space for that. So I've just been thinking a lot about how that can really connect with all different populations and all different communities. Yeah, and I mean, Kathy, because you've done so much work talking within, like really educating people about Asian history and Asian American history, what do you kind of feel as an Asian, as people perceive an Asian American, like what, not only those who work in these spaces and these massage businesses, but what is some of the impact that you think can be perceived as an Asian American?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, what I think about when we talk about these kind of cycles of exploitation, these ripple effects, everything like that, Asian Americans are among, at least in New York City, the groups with the highest rates of poverty. And yet they are also among the demographics that receive the least amount of social services funding from the city, from the state, federally. Asian Americans are one of the least funded in terms of social support services of all demographics out there. And I think a lot of that stems from the model minority myth. This idea that all Asians are doing fine, that we are all achieving some measure of academic and financial success, and therefore we don't need help. I mean, I think when you look at the data, even beyond setting aside the question of the Atlanta shootings, when you look at the data, it's simply not true, right? There are huge income and wealth disparities within this umbrella term of Asian American. And when you zoom into places like New York City, there are huge pockets of working class, low wage earning Asians and Asian Americans who are working in these very difficult and oftentimes invisibilized jobs, doing menial labor, doing things like working in massage businesses, because that is their way of surviving and supporting their families. And many of these communities are disconnected from service providers that, to be frank, are underfunded and need more capacity building resources to be able to serve this community. Asians are, I think recent statistics came out saying that Asians are the fastest growing demographic in the United States overall. And yet I think myths and stereotypes like the model minority myth are preventing us from providing them the resources to support them in an adequate way. And I also want to talk a little bit more specifically about the education space, because that is a space that IHI works in a lot. We work a lot with educators. We work a lot with parents of students who are very, very concerned. And I think the education space is also kind of one area where the model minority myth like really springs into play. Like there's this idea that all Asians are kind of academic rock stars. And I want to direct attention to statistics that have come out. Multiple articles now have come out talking about how Asian American families are sending their students back to school at much lower rates than other families, particularly white families. And obviously it's hard to necessarily draw kind of causation from these statistics, but a large part of it is probably because of safety concerns. We have talked to families across the country who literally tell us that they are terrified for their children, that they don't know what their school is going to do to support their children, that they have reported instances of bullying to their school in the past, but been brushed off, told that it was just kids playing, that it was just teasing, that it's not actually racialized, even when racial slurs are used or racial gestures, etc. Parents are terrified to be in a school system, in an infrastructure that doesn't see their concerns as real and doesn't recognize kind of the history and the context around all of the violence that is happening right now. And when you combine that with what we have seen can be quite devastating effects on students' academic progress and mental health if you keep them in extended online learning, the violence that is being perpetrated both in Atlanta and in the videos that are surfacing every day, they are having tangible impacts on Asian American families across the country that are long-term, that are not going to go away, even if this tide of anti-Asian violence hopefully eventually ebbs.
Yeah, actually, and I wanted to bring a note too when you were even mentioning kind of the model minority myth is a myth, but it is really kind of like working class and like who are we seeing? And I think for a lot of our colleagues who have seen Asian Americans, maybe specifically in a more professional context, then it might be very hard for people to even kind of remove that bias that they've, or the myth that they've taken of model minority as Asians. And I think about in New York City, even thinking about like, how come all of the people, most of the people I've seen collecting cans are what I assume to, or what I've seen to be like Asian descent, right? And so even just kind of thinking about these things and thinking about how people are living, and just because people aren't the most vocal maybe, or people aren't vocal about what's going on in their lives, or that they are living in poverty, or all these things, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. And so I think I would just challenge like us to open our eyes too. I think because a lot of us who work in the professional context may not really realize that, but if we're paying attention, what are we seeing? And who is working in these jobs that we typically may not pay attention to.
Yeah, I think that's totally on point. And I mean, I just using myself as an example. My family came to the States in the 80s, and my father was in grad school and whatever. And like I went to Flushing quite a bit growing up, and Flushing is where a lot of our clients, I think, have had their horrible experiences, having been exploited. And growing up, going to these places, going to Flushing, and like all the, like, to Main Street and the restaurants, like I didn't notice those things. I didn't notice the people who, like, sure, there were people kind of selling goods from the supermarkets and the different kind of groceries that they had there, but like I didn't make that connection. And so I think maybe that's definitely like a class privilege that I had, but also just not um, kind of taking the time to get to know the people working there. Like I kind of knew them in their particular roles, but I didn't really look beyond kind of their humanity. Like I didn't really dig into their humanity, I think, in the ways that I used to kind of go to Flushing. And so now it's a totally different world, I think, after I started working with Sanctuary for Families and on this particular area. But so I think we touched on a lot of different things, like kind of the historical anti-Asian racism. I think patriarchy / misogyny that impacts Asian women, and these kind of perpetuated myths about model minority, and just kind of where Asians stand in America now. And so it's sort of, we've like unpacked a lot of different things, and yet I'm sure there's so much more. What can we do kind of in our respective roles? For people tuning in, how can we be effective allies or accomplices or co-conspirators against the system, and not just kind of immediately respond to highly publicized traumatic events and crises? Like how can we be much more invested in making sure that these isms, like these like kind of racism and classism and all of that, kind of hold us back from dismantling these systems? So maybe I'm going to hand it over to Kathy to answer it first.
Yeah. Thank you, Amy. I do think it's easy to become overwhelmed, right? Like Amy was talking about, there's so many different forces at play here, and it's very easy to feel kind of lost and insignificant and not know what you personally could do to help. So I think it might be easiest to split up this question of what can we do into 3 different categories. First, on a personal level, what you, the individual, can do. Second, on an organizational level, what you can do within your organizations or your workplaces or other community units. And then 3, on a societal level, on a broad level, what can you do to be kind of moving the needle forward towards racial justice and racial equity? So starting with a personal level, I'm going to share my screen again and talk a little bit about bystander intervention. I think this is oftentimes what people think of when we say, what can you do, right? Like what is maybe the first thing that you could do? But we hear this word a lot, and I feel like we kind of know what it means, but we don't necessarily really know what it might look like. So I have on my shared screen here some graphics that IHI developed that try to distill the principles of bystander intervention down into 3 easy steps. So I'm going to walk through the steps, and then Amy and Yvonne are going to assist me in acting a scenario out where hypothetically a bystander could intervene using this framework. So number one, C. C is literally just about staying alert and assessing the situation, right? So not being glued to your phone if you hear some kind of commotion happening in your vicinity. And then once you're aware, assessing what is going on, right? Thinking about your safety and the safety of the victim, thinking about who around you could potentially help in a situation that appears to be rapidly escalating. So C is really about just taking note of everything that is going around you in that moment, taking a moment to take that deep breath and think about that before you react and potentially enter that dangerous situation. So number two, react. React is all about de-escalation. I find that I talk to a lot of people who I think are very rightfully angry about what is going on. Oftentimes when something like this is happening, the attacker is saying really ugly things that people just want to respond to. But what we would recommend instead is de-escalation, not actually directly confronting or engaging the attacker on what they are saying / doing, but providing some kind of distraction. Because the way that I kind of like to think about it is the attacker, the psychology of the attacker is that they are thriving on the attention, on this, for example, like if you're in a subway car, kind of the riveted silence of the people around them as the attacker is making this really huge scene. And so they're really like what they want is that energy and that attention. And so I kind of think about it as like this really big balloon, right? So they are like building up a full head of steam. Everybody's looking at them. They're getting like more and more air into their balloon. So all you need to kind of break that balloon is just one tiny pinprick. It doesn't need to be a big thing. Like if you can just find a way to kind of de-escalate, to distract even just a little bit, oftentimes that energy drains away. That person is done. It's I think sometimes hard to visualize, but I've seen it happen in person, even with just like a little sideways comment or a little adjacent distraction, the attacker just kind of gives it up. Like they've lost their momentum, they start feeling a little stupid and they stop what they're doing and disengage from the situation. And then number three, finally, check in. This is just a reminder to people that even after the incident is over, the experience for the victim is not over. We highly encourage people to go over and check in with the victim, even people who weren't able to intervene at that moment, because what the victim is likely feeling in that instance is isolation, this feeling like the people around them did not care enough to intervene. And so by going over and connecting with them, saying, I saw what happened, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Can I do anything to help right now? Can I take you to where you're going next, etc. Make sure that that person can get to a safe place, can get to a support network to help them through the aftermath of what was a very traumatizing experience. Okay, so I'm going to call on Yvonne and Amy to help me through a hypothetical situation. What might this actually look like in real life? So this hypothetical situation is modeled off of something that actually happened to me early on in the pandemic while I was riding a subway train. So to set the scene, I am on a subway train, sitting down, there's an empty seat next to me, and I'm just minding my own business. I'm looking at my phone, and then Amy enters the scene.
Hey, you, get out of the seat. I don't want to sit next to you, coronavirus.
So then I, as a bystander, I see. So I'm alert. I realize what's happening. I assess my own safety first. I'm concerned that Amy might come up to me. I don't want to get too close. So then instead I look around. There are 3 other people on the train. One person is filming. Another person is staring, but not doing anything. So then after I see and assess, then I react. So then I call out to that person and point to them and say, hey, do you see what's happening? Get the conductor. You in the red shirt, yes, I'm talking to you. And then after the person leaves, I shout from a safe distance, the conductor's on his way, MTA is coming, you might want to get out of here.
Okay, so I'm gonna call a timeout really quickly and just talk a little bit about what Yvonne is doing. So there's a lot of really good things about what she has chosen to do in this instance. So first, taking that moment to think about what's happening and make a plan, right? And the fact that she is prioritizing her own safety is not a bad thing. That's a really good thing. So she has assessed the situation and decided, like, Amy looks violent. She does not want to get close to Amy. So whatever intervention she's going to do, she wants to stay a safe physical distance away. And that's okay. And the second thing that Yvonne did was, while she was assessing the situation, she thought about allies. So she saw somebody who's filming. So someone's already recording, so she doesn't need to record, but there's another person who's free who could potentially help. And so she points that person and describes their physical appearance so they know that she is talking to them. And that is also really important, because when you're in that bystander psychology, it's really difficult to kind of take the first step, because it feels like you're putting yourself in danger. And so by actually identifying that person the best way you can, because you don't know their name, you are making them feel individually involved and individually responsible for doing something in that situation. And that helps break through kind of the bystander psychological barrier to acting. And then number 3, I really like also that Yvonne, she didn't engage with Amy directly, right? She didn't say anything about Amy calling me coronavirus or not wanting to sit next to me in the empty seat, but instead just offering up something really distracting. The idea of potential consequences. Oh, like, what if the conductor comes over here? What if MTA gets involved? Like, you just want to get out. Okay, so Amy, do you have any thoughts about what just happened?
Yeah, and I should say also, I was there on the subway during the subway ride early in the pandemic last year, and I witnessed this whole thing, and I was the bystander. And unlike Yvonne, I legitimately sat there being an observing bystander who did nothing. And I'll tell you what was going on in my head at the time. I was thinking kind of 2 different things. One is, this is kind of typical, that someone would just kind of make up, kind of like just conflate all Asians together and just, based on nothing, like no truth. And I think the person that was actually confronting you that day was this kind of older woman who, in my mind, didn't seem physically threatening to you, but I think had this like really angry demeanor. And so in my mind also, I was thinking, Kathy, you can handle it. I know you. You can probably, tolerate this situation, or maybe like you've been jaded like me and you've seen enough quote unquote crazy people, and it's going to be okay. And we're going to get off in the next exit anyway. And so in my mind, that justified all the reasons why I didn't need to say anything or do anything, and not stand in the way or offer kind of any kind of actual intervening actions. And so for that, I'm very sorry. And I hope that we don't have to encounter that situation again. But if I do, I'll know to see, react, and check in with you, not a whole year later and not during a webinar, but to say, Kathy, how did you feel going through that? And is there anything I can actually do better next time?
Thanks, Amy. But also, I just want to take a moment to kind of talk about what actually happened in that moment. So like Amy said, she was also on the train car. She was a little bit farther away from me because I had wanted to sit down, so I found an empty seat. And there were more people on this train car than just 3 people, like in the scenario. It was actually quite crowded. And for a while, like a few minutes, while the woman is screaming at me, nobody's really doing anything. And so what is going on in my head at that moment is I am frozen, right? So like Amy said, I'm usually a pretty capable person. I can express myself. I'm not afraid to stand up for myself. But in the moment, it feels like you're frozen. Like I can't make words come out of my mouth. I'm just like, I'm surprised by what's happening. I'm appalled. I'm angry and embarrassed, but I don't know what to do to make it better. And so I'm just silent. And what actually happens is I can't make myself say anything, but I start making eye contact with some of the people who are standing around because the train car is quite crowded. I like look at people just thinking like, do people see what's happening? Do people care? Like just like looking at people and making eye contact with a few folks. And then one of the people I make eye contact with is a guy. And what he says is literally, hey, are you gonna sit down in that seat? Because if not, I'm gonna sit. And that was enough to just prick the balloon, right? She completely deflated. She shut up and she actually sat down next to me after that whole tirade. And that was how the incident ended. Okay, so I know we don't have a whole lot of time left. So let's move on perhaps to the organizational level.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So I think for an organizational level, we want to think about what we can do internally. Internally, we can think about, what does bystander intervention look like? Because I can guarantee you that in general, a lot of um, like microaggressions can happen to people at work. And so what does that look like? And microaggressions can look like something even if you're in a meeting and your colleague who is Asian or just your colleague who is a person of color keeps getting interrupted or is like not really allowed to speak or finish their thoughts. So just kind of things like that. And there's a lot of less apparent forms, I would say, of violence against Asian American Pacific Islander folks, but these microaggressions can feel like macroaggressions as well. And so it's important just to really recognize. And then also, so if someone is in a meeting and you keep you recognize that someone keeps being interrupted, you can say like, hey, actually, like, I think they were going to, it sounds like they were going to finish this thought, or it sounds like that was something that they had said earlier. I think just recognizing that these things are happening. And what we can do externally is really just to take time to understand the experiences, specifically of massage business workers, but also just Asian American Pacific Islanders generally, in the community generally. And it's really important to note that Asians are not a monolith. There are over like 100 countries within the Asian diaspora on the continent. So it is really important to recognize that just because an Asian person or a few Asian Americans, we're not a monolith, and there's so many different communities within that giant umbrella. So really just take the time to understand the needs and the wants, and also like what we don't need. I think it's really important to involve communities, not necessarily from an outside standpoint, just say like, I think this community needs X, Y, and Z, even though I am not from that community. So it's really important to really involve people in the community and to really be able to talk about that and name that and how we can include people without tokenizing them. So we can also hire a lot of people within the AAPI community, but not tokenizing them. And tokenizing is a word that I feel like is thrown around a lot, but I think very explicitly, it's important to involve and include people in the fullness of a discussion or the fullness of a decision. And it's not just calling on AAPI folks to execute something at the end. Like, I need this approval of this, that it was viewed by an AAPI person. I need you to do X, Y, and Z, but you don't involve them in the planning or the discussion around that. So I think these are really important things to recognize. And I would say, not only necessarily for like AAPI folks, but other communities in general, it's really important that we don't want to tokenize someone, because in the end, you're also just telling them what to do that you want them to do under your narrative versus just involving and hearing and listening to what they want to do. So I think that's really important. And Amy, what about, like, do you have some thoughts on kind of organizational level as well?
Yeah, I think both of you make great points about, I think, just taking the time to involve the community, particularly for organizations like ours that are serving Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander communities. As an organization, taking the time to understand the history. And I think Kathy gave us a small taste of it, but truly, I think when we don't understand this history, it's easy to dismiss and kind of come up with like kind of our own tropes or understandings based on mass media or stereotypes, right? And I think I had come across this term, misogynoir, for like when there's a particular brand of like anti-black women racism, and I think that that also does exist for Asians. And I tried to Google this last night. I don't actually know if this word exists, but misogynasians. I saw it used once, I think, in relation to Asian women in the tech industry and kind of experiencing a particular brand of sexism there. But I think just taking the time to learn and know this history. And I think I heard in like a different talk post Atlanta about like even certain groups, later arriving groups, not really knowing like earlier history. So like my family coming in the 80s, we really didn't know the long, long history of anti-Asian sentiments or even just like Asian contributions to this country. And so I feel like organizationally taking the time to understand that. But as far as like the direct services side of things, having proximity to the folks that we're trying to serve. And so I think the way that I really got to know our clients is meeting with them, is after Yvonne had been doing outreach at these massage businesses at night and really establishing those connections, really getting to know folks and not from like a let me save you standpoint or let me um, kind of do things for you, but really how can I see your whole person and meet your needs. And then actually on the note of bystander intervention, I know obviously Kathy shared a really useful practical day-to-day version of bystander intervention, but I actually sat in on a really great training yesterday delivered by the Practicing Law Institute about bystander intervention in legal environments. So, if you are a subscriber, you can listen in, but it really also talks about um, this kind of intervention at the organizational level as well.
Awesome. So I'm just going to take a few minutes because I know we're over time to talk about the societal level, right? Like the broad view, big picture of what to do. I would say big picture level, what needs to happen is the shifting of discourse around Asian Americans, around this idea of being the model minority or of being the perpetual foreigner, always an outsider, never an American. And one of the easiest ways to do that right now actually is by supporting a campaign for Asian American studies at your high school or middle school. There are ongoing campaigns right now going on in states like Connecticut, New Jersey, Illinois, where people are pushing for Asian American studies to be taught in school because these stereotypes are something that kids internalize from such a young age, right? Teaching these histories, making the history of Asian Americans real to them and human to them is a really important first step for us to begin unlearning these toxic narratives and these really hateful biases about Asian Americans that are so longstanding and stretch out over so many years. So I would highly encourage y'all to educate yourself, right? Go and watch the PBS Asian Americans documentary, read up in Asian American history, and fight for it, right? Advocate for it to be taught at your school. This can be done at the local level, talking to your child's principal. This can also be done at a state level through policy advocacy, writing to your congressperson. All of these things are really achievable. And we have momentum right now because people are finally talking about this. So we really encourage people to seize the moment and begin using these individual actions to create long-term systematic change in how we see, think, and talk about Asians. I think our time might be up if anyone else has final words that they want to share with the group. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Yeah, I think this was a lot packed in an hour. And so thank you so much, Yvonne, for joining us. Kathy, I know I forced you to be here on your lunch hour. So thank you. And thanks also to Hannah, Eddie, and Chanel, Lamont Ellis, Lisa Mueller, and everyone who's tuned in today. Really hope that it was helpful. And if you have questions or want to reach out to talk about kind of other ways to support the community, and particularly the clients that we're also serving in our respective organizations, please feel free to reach out to those of us. I think you have at least Hannah's contact, and so feel free to reach out. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.